Yeah.
Okay, so today's topic is regarding vitamin D and immunity. And after discussing this important topic, I have added few cases, clinical cases, which are related to, you can say, vitamin D, but having different etiologies, so that we should also keep such a presentation of vitamin D related disorders in clinical practice. So, the new spectrum of vitamin D, in the last 5 years, there has been a remarkable change in our understanding of health benefits of vitamin D. The classical actions of vitamin D as determined is determinant of mineral metabolism and rheumatoid bone disease have been expanded to include broader role in skeletal homeostasis and prevalent bone disorders such as osteoporosis. And the non-skeletal functions of vitamin D are the ones that has attracted most attention in the recent time. A new spectrum of vitamin D biological activities, including important aspect on cellular proliferation, differentiation, and the immune system. Now we'll go to basics first about the synthesis and biochemistry of vitamin D. So from the acetyl choline by the mevalonate pathway, the 7-dehydrocholesterol is produced, and this is called as provitamin D3. And from this, under the UVB radiations under the skin, the pre-vitamin D3 is formed, and spontaneous isomerization occurs to form cholecalciferol, which is called known as vitamin D3. Now, this vitamin D3 is converted to 25-hydroxyvitamin D3 in the liver by the enzyme 25-hydroxylase. And the gene controlling that enzyme is CYP2R1 and CYP27A1. Now, the vitamin D, which is fortified in the various foods, also gets converted to 25-hydroxy through the liver. And the further final step of active vitamin D formation occurs in kidney, which is called as 1-alpha hydroxylation. And the gene responsible for that is CYP27B1. So this leads to formation of calcitriol, or you can call it as 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D. And this has significant role in various tissues, including immune cells, breast, colon, lung, prostate, and skin. So autocrine and paracrine actions, regulation of cell proliferation and differentiation, immune regulation is also one of the role. And of course, in the calcium vitamin D homeostasis, the endocrine action is calcium reabsorption in the kidneys, increased absorption through the gut, and bone remodeling. Those are the classic actions of vitamin D. Now we will just go deeper into non-skeletal functions of vitamin D. So you can see these are the broad headings under which you can discuss this. So basically, first we will understand what about innate immunity. So 25-hydroxy vitamin D is actually not a vitamin, is actually similar to any hormone, because it is produced at one site and the action is at the other level, and the action is through receptor and there is feedback mechanism. So all the criteria which is required to define a particular hormone is fulfilled by vitamin D. So you can see the action action of vitamin D is similar to your steroid hormone. So the vitamin D will go into nucleus. It will lead to expression of some genes through the receptors, and that leads to immune modulation in different cells, like activate T lymphocyte cytokine regulation and activation of B lymphocytes. which leads to immunomodulation. Also, because it inhibits angiogenesis and induces apoptosis in certain cells. And of course, the classic action on parathyroid hormone regulation. It is a negative feedback mechanism by which 125 and parathyroid play with each other. And of course, in kidneys, we know that blood pressure regulation is also regulated by vitamin D. And in pancreas, there is increased insulin secretion as one of the mechanism or theory which is proposed as action of vitamin D, which leads to better blood sugar control. Now, as we discussed, the innate and adaptive immune system, the innate immune system is basically against foreign bodies, injuries, and pathogens, like protection to skin, protection on mucous membranes, and first attack as a scavenger cells. And adaptive is through B and T cells, that is production of immunoglobulins and cytotoxic effect by the T lymphocytes. Now we'll go again in a mechanism of action of vitamin D through the nuclear receptor. As we discussed, it is similar to your steroid hormone action. So vitamin D receptor is a nuclear ligand dependent transcription factor that in complex with hormonally active vitamin D, that is 125 hydroxyvitamin D, regulates the expression of more than 900 genes involved in a wide array of physiological functions. So during binding hormone, VDR binds to specific DNA response elements in the promoter region of target genes, and leading to recruitment and dissociation of additional co-regulatory protein, thus inducing or repressing their transcription activities. Thus, a genomic action of 125 on given target cell are dependent on the presence of vitamin D in that cell, so that regulation of vitamin D receptor levels has important effect on the actions. Vitamin D receptor levels are regulated by several factors, including hormones, growth factors, and calcium. And some of these actions may be mediated by cyclic AMP activated protein kinase A, which increase vitamin D receptor gene expression, or by protein kinase C, which inhibits vitamin D receptor expression. So in addition to vitamin D receptor protein levels are modulated post-translationally by its ligand like 125, which induces receptor stabilization and increases the half-life of this protein. So you can see the summary of this complex process is basically we are trying to understand is the balance between the expression and repression of vitamin D receptors is finely maintained at the cell's cellular level, depending on the environmental milieu. Now, if you see, it is not not only bone, but other tissues which are expressing vitamin D receptors, and you will be surprised to see that these are the n number of, or you can say wide number of cells which are expressing not only bones but adrenals, bone marrow, liver. You can see the list in detail here: pituitary, stomach, testes, thyroid gland, ovaries. There are receptors of vitamin D in almost 80 to 90% of tissues. Now, innate immune response to infection involves the complement system, antibacterial response by neutrophils and macrophages, but also incorporates antigen presentation to lymphocytic cells from the adaptive or acquired immune system. Now, we will focus on monocyte macrophage system, because that is one very important pathway by which vitamin D acts or modulates the immune system. So these are the first line of defense, monocytes and macrophage system. And pathogens are phagocytized by these cells. And activation of monocyte macrophage stimulates expression of vitamin D receptors and 1-alpha hydroxylase. So you can see that whenever there is invasion of pathogens, the phagocytosis action, and this is mediated by these cells, and they in turn increase the vitamin D receptor expression. So the 25-hydroxy vitamin D in circulation bound to vitamin D binding protein is released to the monocyte macrophage and converted to 125 in the mitochondrion. And 125 is then able to bind to VDR and transcriptionally induced target genes such as antimicrobial protein cathepsidin via vitamin D response element in the HCAP gene promoter region. The antimicrobial protein B defensin 4 also exhibits a gene promoter VDRE but requires co-stimulation by activators of NF factor, nuclear factor beta, such as IL-1 to promote transcriptional upregulation to DEFB4. Induction of these facilitates autophagosome generation and promotes bacterial killing in the resulting autolysosomes. So basically, this is a process in gist. What is gist of this slide is this is a process through which the phagocytosis and killing of bacteria occurs, and there is expression of vitamin D related genes which help in this process. Again, vitamin D in dendritic cells and antigen presentation. So differentiation of monocyte to immature and mature dendritic cells is associated with the induction of 1-alpha hydroxylase and suppression of vitamin D receptor expression. So in this way, local conversion of vitamin D can impact the dendritic cell function in several ways. So synthesis of 125 by MDCs activate VDR signaling in an intracrine fashion despite low number of VDR, suppressing dendritic cell function and antigen presentation to adjacent T cells. Synthesis of this by MDC activates VDR signaling in the paracrine fashion, suppressing maturation of adjacent dendritic cells and thereby promoting tolerogenic T cell response. And it also acts in a paracrine fashion on vitamin D expressing T cells, promoting generation of immunosuppressive regulatory T cells. So it is not only endocrine, but it is intracrine, paracrine, and paracrine actions, which on one hand, as we saw in monocyte macrophage system, help in killing bacteria. On other system, it also helps in immunosuppression. So the unregulated immune activation, which is harmful in certain infections like COVID, is also that's why vitamin D is also playing a role in protecting against severe form of COVID infection. Vitamin D and adaptive immunity. So effects of vitamin D on human adaptive immune cells demonstrates an expression of nuclear VDR as well as vitamin D activating enzymes in both T and B cells. Notably, VDR expression by these cells is very low in a resting condition, but upon activation and proliferation, they upregulate expression of VDRs, allowing regulation of up to 500 vitamin D responsive genes, which influence the proliferation of the cells. So in B cells, anti-proliferative effects of calcitriol, such as inhibition of differentiation, proliferation, initiation of apoptosis, and decrease immunoglobulin production, were initially considered to be exclusively mediated by T helper cells. More recent studies have confirmed additional direct effects of calcitriol on B cell homeostasis, including inhibition of memory and plasma cell generation, as well as promotion of apoptosis of immunoglobulin producing cells. This plays a major role in the pathophysiology of autoimmunity. So these are the various mechanisms, as you can see, that inhibition of T cell stimulation by antigen and lectin, and this is either direct endocrine effect on T cells mediated by systemic calcitriol, intracrine conversion of 25 to calcitriol by T cells, and paracrine effect of calcitriol on T cells following conversion to calcitriol by monocyte or dendritic cells. Indirect effects on antigen presentation of to T cells mediated via localized antigen presenting cells affected by calcitriol. So again, this is a complex diagram, but essentially it is showing the different endocrine and paracrine effects of vitamin D. So in summary, you can see that more the vitamin D decrease in the health problems, not only from, so in age-old days, you must have heard that tuberculosis patients, when there were no AKT drugs available, those patients who were exposed to sun or they were treated in a balcony, they were getting recovered as compared to those who are inside. And the one of the mechanism which logically I think was the vitamin D production whenever they are exposed to sun, and this vitamin D was helping cell-mediated immunity to fight the chronic condition like tuberculosis to them. So other conditions in which non-communicable diseases on which it is considered helpful is hypertension, ischemic heart disease. Of course, bone health is bone-related mechanism is proven, and other things are proposed, like decrease in the pancreatic cells, renal cancers, breast cancer. Type 1 diabetes is also thought as a has some connection with the vitamin D. Then this is a paper in which it was studied that is vitamin D is helpful in prevention of respiratory tract infections. So upper respiratory as well as lower respiratory tract infections. So it is believed that vitamin D increases the production of natural antibodies and also known to strengthen the immunity. So the objective was to explore the supplementation prevention of RTIs. You can see the event respiratory tract infections were significantly lower in vitamin D group as compared to control according to random model, and results were similar in fixed model. So when this was analyzed, the conclusion was that vitamin D supplementation decreases the events related to respiratory infections. There is a need of more well-conducted clinical trials to reach the certain conclusion. So there is some evidence that it prevents the or it protects from respiratory infections. Vitamin D plays an important role in community-acquired pneumonia. So the association between vitamin D deficiency and community-acquired pneumonia is studied in this paper. And you can see that 8 observational studies involving almost 20,000 subjects were included. And the community-acquired pneumonia patients with vitamin D deficiency experienced a significantly increased risk of pneumonia. Odds ratio was 1.64, and obviously decrease of 5.63 nanogram per ml in serum vitamin D was demonstrated in the pneumonia patients. So sensitivity analysis showed that exclusion of any single study did not materially alter the overall combined effect. And the evidence from this meta-analysis indicate an association between vitamin D deficiency and increase in the risk of pneumonia. However, well-designed trials are required to determine the explicit effect of vitamin D supplementation. Now, in this study, vitamin D in patients with frequent respiratory infection, a randomized and double-blind study was done. The main conclusion is that vitamin D supplementation reduces symptoms and antibiotic consumption among patients with increased frequency of respiratory infections. Thus, vitamin D supplementation may be an alternative strategy to reduce antibiotic use among patients with recurrent respiratory infections. Now, a bit about neonatal immunity. So what about vitamin D and neonatal immunity? So umbilical cord plasma, vitamin D concentration and immune function at birth, the urban environmental and childhood asthma study. Low cord blood concentrations have been associated with RSV, bronchiolitis, and respiratory infections, and low levels of neonatal vitamin D have been linked to childhood asthma. Cord blood samples deficient in vitamin D had less effect on adult monocyte cathepsin gene expression compared with vitamin D replete cord blood. So a bit about practical and social aspect. Why there is widespread deficiency? So the reason is latitude, season, time of the day, then cloud cover, atmospheric pollution, customary dresses, sunscreen use, skin pigmentation, and age. So there are so many variables which determine the production of endogenous vitamin D, which are difficult to control. Then there are questions which has to be answered on, and some of them are answered but not objectively. So what is the best time for sun exposure? What percent of body surface area should be exposed? Duration of exposure in winter versus summer. Then again, vitamin D synthesis depends on age, amount of vitamin D obtained from diet, skin pigmentation, and sunshine intensity. So while vitamin D levels below 30 are common in most populations, levels below 10, which constitutes frank vitamin D deficiency, are most seen in population at risk, in particular the elderly. So in some regions, such as South Asia and Middle East, frank vitamin D deficiency is common in all age groups from neonates to elderly. Given the proposed definition of vitamin D sufficiency, it is possible that population at high risk will have to resort to supplementation to achieve desired vitamin D levels. So as all of us know that our Indian skin is type 5, and this type 5 skin again is one of the hindrance for penetration of UVB rays and in turn production of vitamin D. Now, which are the factors affecting response to treatment? So one is age and patient's compliance, the type and duration of vitamin D which is used, baseline vitamin D concentration, variation of absorption, and concomitant disease. So wait for minimum period of 3 to 4 months, approximately 5 half-lives of vitamin D to allow attainment of new steady state vitamin D. So why to monitor? To detect those who remain deficient, detect those who become deficient during maintenance, and detect those patients in whom vitamin D therapy uncovers subclinical primary hyperparathyroidism. Now we'll proceed to the prevention and treatment aspect of this vitamin D deficiency. So deficiency responds rapidly to vitamin D supplements or adequate UV radiation. Most frequently treated with oral vitamin D2 or D3, a single large dose of oral administered vitamin D has been useful when patient compliance may be problematic. Now, IAP recommends 60,000 units of vitamin D weekly for 6 weeks, and healing occurs more rapidly by these larger doses. Mind you, this dosages is there in older children, not young children. Prevention. So principal source of vitamin D is exposure to sunlight, but not much effective in severe deficiency, in which we want early levels to achieve in a normal range. In fortification of food with vitamin D, routine vitamin D fortification should be considered, but may not be sufficient to prevent deficiency. And use of vitamin D preparation, that is the most preferred treatment in infants. And vitamin D deficiency who do not ingest at least 1 liter vitamin D fortified milk per day. So who do not get regular sunlight exposure. So most of the infants will be under this category, who require supplementation with vitamin D throughout first year of life. Now, high doses like STOS therapy used to be practiced, but nowadays the recommendations have changed, and they are associated with hypervitaminosis. That's why there is limited evidence to superiority of any particular regime, but various options include daily, intermittent, and single dose. And STOS is generally not preferred unless and until you are very, very concerned about the compliance of the patient. Lower doses are effective in treating rickets without causing toxicity. And in general, healing of rickets takes place over a period of 8 to 12 weeks. So only cholecalciferin available for treatment. D3 is available in India, and treatment is aimed at achieving healing with adequate doses of vitamin D without causing risk of hypervitaminosis and hypercalcemia. Now, what are the IAP guidelines say? So premature neonates, the calcium and phosphorus in the breast milk do not meet the needs of rapidly growing premature infants who have missed some of the critical period of intrauterine bone growth. So this puts them at risk of metabolic bone disease. So mind you, not only calcium but phosphorus. Calcium is 150 to 200. The dosage is higher, MKD, and phosphorus is almost 75 to 140 milligram per kg per day, along with vitamin D of 400 IU is recommended for all preterm babies for to prevent the effects related to vitamin D and metabolic bone disease. Then neonates and infants up to 1 year of age who are for other full-term babies, only 400 IU vitamin D supplementation and continuing breastfeeding is recommended. There is no need to give extra calcium supplementation or phosphorus supplementation, because commonly I see the prescriptions of pediatricians in which they always give calcium supplementation along with vitamin D to even a full-time baby. So it is not necessary. You can just give a vitamin D preparation, and calcium RDA is fulfilled through the breast milk. So this table, this is readily available, and I think this should be there in your consulting room whenever you see any patients for a treatment guidelines, because for particular age the treatment is different and the duration is different. So you can see preterm, the for prevention it is 400, for 1 to 18 it is 600. Then for treatment purpose, in premature babies it is 1000 units per day, in newborns it is 2000 units per day, in infants again 2000, and in 1 to 18 years it is almost up to 6000 units per day. Okay, and the STOS therapy, which is less preferred, can be given only beyond 1 year of age. You never can give this 60,000 units before 1 year of age. This is very important because you definitely will cause hypervitaminosis, toxicity, hypercalcemia, renal stones in younger children. So please do not give such mega dosages in younger children. Then we'll go ahead for the guidelines. Again, this is APEG and British guidelines for which are similar to our IAP guidelines. So we can follow our IAP guidelines for treatment, both as well, both for prevention as well as treatment. Now, a bit about the degree of vitamin D content. So vitamin D content of most commercial preparations is not within the prescribed acceptable range. So in study conducted by Dr. Khadgawat, only 28.5% formulations were within the range. Percentage of vitamin D content varied from minus 91% to plus 65%. And this variation may lead to both under treatment as well as vitamin D toxicity. Now, there is a challenge in the absorption of vitamin D. As you can see that in this schematic representation of intestinal cells showing potential trans-epithelial pathway, paracellular route, and transcellular passive diffusion and receptor-mediated transcytosis. Now, the challenges in current formulations are vitamin D formulation is available in capsule, granule, powder. Since vitamin D is liposoluble, dietary fat increases absorption. Many doctors advise to take vitamin D with a glass of milk, thus making the compliance difficult. Studies show a huge variation in vitamin D levels in fed and fasting state. Now, absorption of nanoparticles. So absorption of nanoparticles takes place via 3 pathways: paracellular, transcellular, and persorption. So the interesting one is persorption. So nanoparticles gets absorbed through the gas formed in the layer of epithelial cells lining the gastrointestinal tract due to shading and replacing of cells. Hence, their absorption is not fat dependent and it's unaffected by fed and fast variation. So you can see the advantage of nanoparticles here regarding absorption. Again, the bioavailability of nanoparticles, the size of pores between the cross-linked and entangled biopolymers within the mucous layers restrict particle penetration. And the particles smaller than the mesh size penetrates through the mucous layer easily, whereas those with similar or larger dimensions then to the mesh size gets hindered. So the conventional drug particles thus goes through very slowly and gets blocked as compared to nanoparticles. So bioavailability of nanoparticles has been found to be 3 times higher than the conventional drugs. Now, through Aquel technology, so vitamin D molecules are entrapped into nanolipid particulate system having a size of less than 300 nm. and surface of this nanoparticle are attached with polar head group, which makes them hydrophilic in nature and highly water miscible. So essentially, we are trying to make lipophilic substance into hydrophilic substance for better absorption. This is a you can say a summary of the nanoparticle mechanism by which it works. Now, what is the convenience? Since nanoparticles gets absorbed paracellularly, transcellular, and by persorption, their absorption is independent of amount of fat in the gut, and compliance of taking nanoparticles is high as it does not require milk or clarified butter for absorption. And the formulation is highly palatable and ready to drink short. Results are assured in fed as well as fasting state. So just a summary of these vitamin D related thing. So it affects on innate and adaptive system, regulation of, we saw monocyte and macrophage, enhancement of antimicrobial properties, regulation of dendritic cells, then promotion of Th2 response, inhibition of inflammation, enhances regulatory T cells, and suppression of T cell proliferation and autoimmune process. Now we'll go to few cases which I recently came across regarding rickets, but they were not responding to the regular treatment with the rickets. So I thought I should share with these two this case particularly with you, so that we can have a discussion about this unusual type of rickets. So this was a Shambhuraje 3-year-old boy. He came with progressive bilateral bowing of legs since he started walking. No history of fractures in the past, no history of polyuria or oliguria or renal problems, no significant pain in the legs actually. When you expect, when you see such a degree of bowing and bone related problem, you expect some amount of pain, but surprisingly, the pain was not, was very minimal. This is one clue for a diagnosis actually. No recurrent chest infections. Mother is also having similar leg deformity since early childhood. So there was bilateral genu varum. Signs of rickets were there, but they were more in lower limbs than upper limbs. No tenderness. He had received multiple vitamin D, multiple formulations, multiple dosages, mega dosages, even injectable, but he did not respond to those treatment. And we'll see his biochemistry. So his serum phosphorus was 2.3, which was low. Alkaline phosphatase was high. Serum calcium was normal. 25 vitamin D was 81, which was actually high normal, you can say. PTH was 32. 125 hydroxy vitamin D level was 48, which was normal. And this is very interesting investigation which I did, which was FGF 23. So it was very high. So you can see FGF 23 was 1130, which is very high. Then with this, I went ahead for his calculation of urinary phosphate and tubular reabsorption capacity. So you can see this is a ready-made medcal which is available even on online. You can just put in the parameters, serum phosphate, urine phosphate, serum creatinine, urinary creat, and you get a TRP, which in this case was 81.48, which is in the face of hypophosphatemia is less. That means the meaning of this is there is significant urinary phosphate wasting in this patient. And this is a nomogram, which is classically described in textbook, which you can use to calculate the tubular reabsorption of phosphate. So basically, this was a familial hypophosphatemic rickets, and obviously it will not respond to any amount of vitamin D you give, because the basic pathophysiology is low phosphate and excessive urinary phosphate wasting. So we will just go discuss a bit about differentiation between this calcipenic or calcium related rickets and phosphate related rickets. So you can see, if it is calcium related rickets, what is the problem? It is either in the vitamin D level or vitamin D action, that is resistance, or deficient calcium intake, which can lead to rickets. Now, in contrast to that, in hypophosphatemic rickets, which there is increase in the FGF23 level, which leads to excessive phosphate losses. So there are n number of diseases which are associated with, like XLH, X-linked, autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, fibrous dysplasia, Den disease, and so on. And renal defects like Fanconi syndrome and HHRH. These are the causes of hypophosphatemic rickets. Now, how do you differentiate between calcipenic and phosphopenic rickets? So basically, these are the clinical features by which if you carefully look into them, you will understand the difference. So muscle weakness is present in calcipenic rickets. It is generally absent. Bony pains common in calcium related, uncommon in phospho. Extremities, all limbs are equally involved in hypophosphatemic, predominantly lower legs. Tetany always may be present in calcium, never present in phosphate. Enamel hypoplasia may be present in calcium, absent in phosphate. Dental abscess are a clue for phosphate problem, not calcium. Serum calcium, low or normal, always normal in phosphate. Phosphorus is remember, very, very important clinical and biochemical analysis, which you should understand that serum phosphorus level is low in both calcipenic rickets as well as this phosphopenic. Now, why do you think serum phosphate is low in calcipenic rickets? So as the calcium levels drops, the most important hormone which sensitive to low calcium is PTH. PTH level will increase. PTH will lead to decreased reabsorption in the proximal renal tubule of phosphorus, and that leads to secondary hyperparathyroidism, and that's why phosphate is low in both calcipenic and phosphopenic rickets. Alkaline phosphatase obviously will be high in both. Parathyroid is elevated in calcipenic, or slightly elevated in phosphopenic. Osteopenia is present in calcipenic, in phosphopenic. So yeah, this is a very important diagram. If you understand this, it's very easy to understand the all types of rickets actually. So you can see that how these players interact with each other. PTH, calcitriol, phosphorus, and FGF23. So you remember FGF23 will cause phosphate wasting. If there is a high phosphorus level, then FGF23 will increase. If there is low phosphorus level, FGF23 will decrease. PTH, calcitriol will cause negative feedback to PTH. If low calcitriol is there, PTH will increase. If PTH increases, production of alpha calcitriol will increase by 1-alpha hydroxylase activity. So these are the interaction of them with each other. Now, this is again different types like we discussed: XLH, ADHR, and TIO. These are the types of hypophosphatemia. And the basic mechanism is increase in the FGF23 leads to decrease in an NAP2 transporter and increase excretion. And that leads, because FGF23 is increased, there is decrease in the 1-alpha hydroxylase activity and decreased reabsorption. Now, FGF23 reduces the phosphate level by these mechanisms. So it suppresses 1-alpha hydroxylase activity. It inhibits NAP2A and NAP2C. That leads to phosphate excretion. And ultimately what happens? Sorry, increased phosphate excretion. And ultimately that leads to low in the serum phosphate level. Now, how do you treat these patients? So the treatment is not vitamin D only, and the most important treatment for this is oral phosphate. So oral phosphate is rapidly absorbed and rapidly excreted. So this leads to secondary hyperparathyroidism, and that can lead to hypercalciuria and nephrocalcinosis, which actually, if ignored, can lead to chronic kidney disease. So it is very, very, very important to monitor urinary calcium create ratio and USG for renal stones while patient is on treatment. Then there is a newer player which has come for our help, which is called as Burusumab, a monoclonal antibody which binds and inhibits excess FGF23 and has revolutionized the treatment in contrast to conventional treatment, because it leads to proper stable normal serum phosphate level and healing of rickets. So So this is just a monitoring of treatment, and these are the markers which we generally monitor while we treat these patients. Now, very important slide. All of you should always interpret the serum phosphate level with respect to age. If you see that the phosphate level is higher in younger age and the range is lower as age advances. A bit about the other type of hypophosphatemic rickets, which is called as hereditary hypophosphatemic rickets with hypercalciuria. Very rare. I have one patient with this entity. The only difference in the treatment is we don't give calcitriol in the treatment of these patients because they already have tendency of hypercalciuria. This is just a table which is showing all types of hypophosphatemic rickets and the differentiation which we already have discussed. So basically, the phosphate homeostasis is very challenging. Once you balance the between absorption and urine excretion, then you will get a normal phosphate homeostasis and normal bone health. Thank you very much for your kind patient listening. Thank you.
So, requesting participant, they can unmute from their side and they can put their questions if they are having. I got a questions, doctor. Will doing bone density in general people help in picking up vitamin deficiency, especially asymptomatic, non-invasive?
Okay. Remember, bone density is a tool which is used to assess the overall bone health. But the challenges of doing bone density is one is the technique is not widely available. Even if it is available, the interpretation is very important. In adults, the T scores are defined and standardized, and you can assess the osteoporosis and osteopenia. So when there is -2 up to -2, it is osteopenia. More than -3 is osteoporosis, and the treatment accordingly we can give for the same. But doing bone density will only tell you that there is some metabolic bone disorder. It will not point out to the etiology. So the osteoporosis maybe because of vitamin D. It may be because of some tumor which is sitting in lungs and causing secondary osteoporosis because of excess FGF23 production. So doing bone density is just a starting point or which can tell you, but only thing which is difficult is in pediatric the standards are not yet there, and it is very difficult for interpretation of bone density in pediatric population. But in adults, of course, there are guidelines and we can use it based on the clinical scenario. So you can assess bone health, but it is not specific to vitamin D deficiency. There may be other causes also. I hope I have answered it. Or if Sheetal sir wants to unmute and clarify on that or discuss on that, I'm happy to do that.
Any other queries? Sir, nowadays the talk of time is the immunity regarding vitamin D3 and immunity. So, what should be the level of vitamin D that will give the better immunity in compared to the normal one? What should be the level of vitamin D should be there in patients?
So there are different guidelines, groups, and which advocate 30 as a cutoff, and there are some groups which advocate 20 as a cutoff for adequate bone health. So I will not go into that debate, but generally, according to IIP guidelines, I think more than 20 is okay. Between 10 to 20 is deficiency, but below 10 is severe deficiency. So if it is below 10, it will definitely affect not only your bone and skeletal problem related issues, but it will also impact on your immunity. So any patient who is having anyone who is having less than 10 should definitely get a supplementation of vitamin D, specifically to prevent to improve the immunity and to prevent the COVID related problems which we are facing. So even if you get COVID, you will not get significant complications if vitamin D is okay, and that is just one aspect. So there are many other aspects for prevention of complications and morbidity, mortality in COVID, but vitamin D is one small part of it.
So the daily consumption of vitamin D is 400 IU or 800 IU, so far as the growth and development is concerned of the neonatals.
So from newborn to 1 year, full-time babies, we give 400 IU per day is a recommended supplementation. And so in some guidelines, those babies who are preterm, they have given 600 or 800 also. But there is the exact evidence is lacking about preterm babies, how much to give, which is in some studies it has shown that 600 or 800, and some studies up to 1000 units also has been given, that it is beneficial for these preterm babies. But as far as now, the recommendation is only 400 to both preterm and full-term babies.
Any other questions from the audience? Hello. Welcome, sir. Srinivas, sir. Good evening.
Good evening.
Is there any questions from your side, sir? Yeah.
No.
Suggestion? Any feedback?
No, nothing.
Any experiences of vitamin D?
No,
you want to share to your colleagues, sir?
not much to add anyway.
Thank you very much for joining, doctor. If there is no question, then we can end this meeting. So I would like to thank very much for Dr. Aniket Kumbhaskar sir for the lucid elaboration and description of the vitamin D3, as well as the nicely he has elaborated the case studies, and I hope definitely it will be give a path to your newer vision to treating the patients. So in coming days also we will organize such new idea with new ideas, many more scientific discussions. So your presence is highly solicited, sir. So thank you very much, Dr. Aniket Kumbhaskar, and all the participants, those who are joined from their busy schedules. Thanks a lot, and be in safe, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, sir, for being with us.